Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar on the final rules for elective pay. To open our program, it's my pleasure to introduce Christina Costa, Deputy Assistant to the President for Clean Energy Innovation and Implementation. Christina, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Thanks, everybody, for being here with us today. President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act represents the single largest investment in building a clean energy economy and combating climate change ever. In just the last 18 months since the president signed this bill into law, we've seen a boom in investment in clean energy manufacturing and deployment in communities across the United States. But the Inflation Reduction Act is also unlocking whole new ways of planning, financing, and building clean energy projects so that communities and families can share more directly in the benefits of a clean energy economy. Earlier today, Treasury and the IRS released final rules related to one of what I think is one of the most exciting provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act, elective pay, or as we like to call it here on our side of campus, direct pay. This innovative new provision unlocks access to clean energy tax credits for the first time for tax-exempt entities, including states, cities, counties, tribes, territories, school districts, public hospitals, houses of worship, nonprofit organizations, and all kinds of other tax-exempt organizations. This is a huge opportunity for communities and community-based organizations to play an active role in building the clean energy economy from the ground up. Treasury and the IRS released proposed rules for both of the IRA's credit monetization provisions, direct pay and its sister provision, transferability, last June. And since then, hundreds of direct pay projects have sought registration numbers using the IRS's Energy Credits Online portal. In general, thanks to Energy Credits Online, direct pay entities that file for their projects by their due date and get all the forms right can anticipate a payment from the IRS within as little as 45 days or less of the due date of your annual return. This is going to provide incredible certainty and clarity to a wide range of direct pay eligible entities looking to take advantage of these provisions and build clean energy projects right now. So with today's final rules, we expect direct pay to really take off even more in 2024. This has been really an all hands on deck effort from Treasury and the IRS to not only draft guidance about these really innovative new provisions, but to stand up all the back end systems necessary to actually make this as straightforward and predictable as possible for eligible entities. So I want to end by thanking our colleagues at Treasury and the IRS for all the incredible work that has gone into this project, and to thank all of you in turn for taking that work and turning it into real progress on the ground. So Ryan, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Christina. And now to continue our presentation, it's a pleasure to introduce Seth Hanlon, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax and Climate Policy at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Seth, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ryan and Christina. So yes, this is an exciting day for us at Treasury, having released the final regulations on elective pay this morning, and some associated guidance that I'll discuss. So as Secretary Yellen has said, elective pay is a catalyst for meeting President Biden's historic economic and climate goals, because elective pay acts as a force multiplier, bringing governments and nonprofits to the table for the first time with these clean energy credits, and also enabling companies to realize greater value from certain key incentives. So that's why providing clarity and certainty around the rules on elective pay was a priority for us, and why we're excited to be issuing the final rules today. And as Christina alluded to, the official name is elective pay because that's the name in the Inflation Reduction Act itself. But when I say elective pay, I'm talking about the same thing that many people call direct pay. Okay, so sorry. First, we have to start out with just some disclaimers. So this slide deck provides an overview of certain Inflation Reduction Act tax provisions for general informational purposes only. It's not itself tax guidance. The content in this presentation is based on tax guidance on irs.gov. We have more specific links to IRS website and other resources later in this deck. So I'll rely on simplifications and generalizations to convey high-level points about IRA tax provisions. But of course, please refer to the guidance issued by the IRS itself for detailed information on the rules. Okay, so the agenda, so I'm going to go over just elected pay in general, and then talk about today's final regulations and some of the highlights, and then another piece of guidance that we issued in conjunction with the elected pay final regulations regarding partnerships and co-ownership arrangements, and how they can access elective pay. And then finally, we'll talk about the IRS's energy credits online and the process for claiming credits through elective pay. Right. So IRA, Christina mentioned, it's the largest investment in clean energy in U.S. history. Most of the investment is delivered via tax incentives. And so that's why the Treasury Department is the federal agency responsible for administering much of this in our capacity as administrator of the tax code. And so we're proud to be playing a central role in IRA implementation. IRA includes tax incentives for a broad range of activities. And then there are cross-cutting provisions and bonuses that apply to multiple incentives. And so this presentation discusses one of those cross-cutting provisions, elective pay. And elective pay is a novel tax credit delivery mechanism created by the Inflation Reduction Act. So what's so important about elective pay is that for the first time, tax exempt and governmental entities that don't owe federal income taxes can receive a payment equal to the full value of tax credits for building qualifying clean energy projects or making qualifying investments. And these are tax credits, and they're unlike competitive grant and loan programs where applicants, even if they're qualified for the program, might not receive an award through a competitive process. Elective pay allows entities to get the tax credit payment if they meet the requirements for using elective pay and for the underlying tax credit. And they would do that by filing a tax return and using electing elective pay. When they do that, they would receive tax-free cash payments for the IRS for the clean energy tax credits that they've earned. Of course, they need to meet all the requirements, including the pre-filing registration requirement that I'll discuss later. And so elective pay applies to 12 of the credits that we'll list in a second. And so we're tracking, this is the first filing season with elective pay. And as of late February, entities had already requested registration numbers for more than 450 projects or facilities. So we're excited to see the real world results coming in. Okay, so like I mentioned, elective pay applies to 12 different of the tax credits that were in IRA, either created or modified by IRA. And so they include the major I won't go through this in detail, but they include the major production and investment tax credits for electricity from renewable sources and clean electricity. The credit for carbon oxide sequestration, that's the 45Q credit. The zero emission nuclear power production credit. Go to the next slide. Two of the credits for clean energy manufacturing, including the 48C Advanced Energy Project Credit and the Advanced Manufacturing Production Credit. Two of the important clean vehicles incentives, the credit for qualified commercial clean vehicles under Section 45W, and also the alternative fuel vehicle refueling property credit under 30C. that goes for EV charging stations and similar property. And then also the 2 of the fuel production credits for hydrogen and for clean fuels. As you may know, there are bonuses, certain requirements and bonuses that affect the amount of the underlying tax credits that entities can claim through elective pay. And the way it works is that these bonuses affect the amount of the tax credit, and so the bonuses themselves can effectively be claimed through elective pay because they're part and parcel of the tax credit. For a number of the tax credits, the credit amount is 5 times bigger if projects meet requirements for paying prevailing wages and using registered apprentices. There's a domestic content bonus specific to the production and investment tax credits. That's 45, 45Y, 48, and 48E. Those are sections of the tax code. So that provides either a 10% or 10 percentage point increase if the domestic requirements are met in the essentially in the construction of the facility. For projects or facilities beginning construction this year in 2024, for the taxpayers using elective pay, it's important to note that the domestic content requirement can be a bonus, but it can also result in a reduction of the PTC or ITC if it is not met. And Treasury had recently issued guidance on this rule for projects that are beginning construction this year, and that's Notice 2024-9. And then there are 2 place-based bonuses, the Energy Communities bonus, which provides an increase in the PTC and ITC. You can go to energycommunities.gov to see a map that indicates where potential areas that are potentially eligible, and also the low-income communities bonus credit that bumps up the amount of the credit for facilities located in low-income communities, Indian lands, on federal housing projects, or serving low-income households. And this is sort of the exception to the rule in that notwithstanding what I said earlier about not having to apply in a competitive process to claim IRA tax credits in general, for the low-income communities bonus credit, there is a competitive an allocation process, an annual allocation process that entities apply for a capacity allocation in order to claim the bonus. Okay, so some of the highlights of today's final regulations. Yeah, I'll cover these 4 things. I think we can go on to the next slide. And before I cover them, just a note about the process to get here. So we had issued proposed regulations on elective pay last June, and we had received and carefully considered 151 written comments. They were extremely helpful. As always, we conducted both a public hearing, IRS public hearing, and also a tribal consultation. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is that that stakeholders weighed into these processes, because it really does help us think about and shape the development of the final rules. And so a note there, so today's guidance is only for the elective pay mechanism. There's also the IRA's mechanism for transferability to transfer credits that are earned. And we are issuing final regulation. We issued proposed regulations on that also last June, and we'll be issuing final regulations in the near future. Okay, so here are some of the highlights. We can go to the next slide for the first one, definition of applicable entity. Okay, so applicable entity is the term. So applicable entity in general is, those are the entities that are eligible to use elective pay. And so the final rule clarifies what types of entities are considered applicable entities and therefore eligible to use elective pay. They include tax-exempt organizations, and we made a clarification in the final regulations. So under the final rules, this includes organizations described in sections 501 to 530 of the code. And so importantly, that will include section 528 homeowners associations, which is something that we heard from commenters. There was a need for clarity on that. The final rules also clarify that U.S. territorial governments and their political subdivisions, so for example, local governments, are eligible to use elective pay. States and their political subdivisions, Indian tribal governments and their subdivisions, and then also we clarified what was proposed, in the proposed rules, that for all levels of government, state, local, tribal, territorial, their agencies and instrumentalities are also eligible for elective pay. And then Alaska Native corporations are eligible, the TVA, and rural electric co-ops. And a note there, the final regulations clarify that both tax-exempt and taxable rural electric co-ops are considered applicable entities. Another area where commenters had asked for clarity. And just the note at the bottom, these are the applicable entities that are generally eligible for elective pay. However, other taxpayers can elect to be treated as an applicable entity for 3 of the tax credits. Okay, we'll give them one. So the final rules also finalized the proposed rules regarding the pre-filing registration process, which we'll talk about the process a little more. But pre-filing registration. So in other words, a registration, there's an online registration that has to be done before the entity files the tax return that actually makes the elective pay election and claims the credit. And so it's authorized in the IRA and mandatory. And it really is a critical tool for the IRS to safeguard against fraud and improper payments. And so the final regulations describe, the process, the manner of filing, the process for members of a consolidated group, the timing, and various other requirements. There is a further guidance on this that goes into much more detail about the actual process. Publication 5884. Pre-filing registration tool user guide and instructions. And so, so these are the overarching rules for pre-filing registration. But we are, this being the first tax filing season with elective pay and transferability, we'll continue to, monitor how it's going to see how we can make it more efficient and user-friendly in the future. And certainly feedback is welcome, more than welcome there. Okay, so entities that do not have a filing obligation. So, so a number of commenters requested clarification on how entities that do not have an income tax filing requirement or a requirement to file a Form 990 information return can determine their tax year. And so and many of them had pointed to the whether they could use in particular for 2023, whether they could use the calendar year 2023 to file and make an elective pay election for tax credits that were earned in 2023. So the final rules permit taxpayers, if they're filing an initial Form 990T, which is the form to claim these tax credits and make an elective pay election, if they do not have a filing requirement, and so therefore have not established a tax year, they can adopt a tax year based on either a calendar year or a fiscal year. So they can choose either. provided that they maintain adequate books and records, including a reconciliation between the tax and fiscal year, calendar and fiscal year to the extent that they differ. So we have an example of this on the next slide. And so this is an example of a town, so it's a public entity. It does not have a federal income tax return requirement under section 6011. It doesn't have a federal return requirement under 6033, which is the section that requires Form 990s. But it's filing a Form 990T for the sole purpose of using elective pay. So in this example, their fiscal year begins on July 1st, but they're able to elect a calendar year. And so that would allow them, if they had placed in service applicable credit property in, let's say, April of 2023, before their fiscal year begins, they can file for the calendar year and therefore claim that the credit for that property. And they would actually do that. So it would do the pre-filing registration first, and then the normal filing deadline would be May 15th for 2024 for entities filing on a calendar year. One of the features of the proposed rules that the final rules clarifies and finalizes is a special rule regarding how entities can combine grants and forgivable loans that they receive with the IRA tax credits. And so the rule provides, and so this this rule enables entities to combine or stack different sources of funding, including the IRA tax credits. And so how the rule works is that if a investment related credit property, so in other words, a property that is claiming an investment tax credit, so let's say like a solar installation or something, is funded by a tax-free grant or forgivable loan, and that can be from a government source or a private source, any tax-free grant or forgivable loan, the entity gets the same value of the eligible IRA tax credit as if the investment were financed with taxable funds. So in other words, the grant or forgivable loan does not reduce the value of the tax credit, with the one caveat that the amount of the credit plus the amount of restricted tax exempt amount, or in other words, the amount of the grant or forgivable loan does not exceed the cost of the investment itself. So we have two examples here. I think in the interest of time, I won't go through them in detail, but just to touch on them. So the first example is a school district that receives the tax exempt grant to purchase an electric school bus, which is eligible for the Section 45W Clean Commercial Vehicle Credit. And the maximum credit is generally $40,000 for clean commercial vehicles. And so this is just an example of how the grant amount does not reduce the amount of the 45W credit, and they still get a $40,000 tax credit. And then the example on the right is a example of the Section 48 investment tax credit, where a higher ed institution gets a tax exempt grant to install a solar farm, which is eligible for the Section 48 investment tax credit. In this fact pattern, the entity gets a 40% investment tax credit. And the upshot here is that tax credit, so it's 40% of the 10 million cost of the solar farm, and that amount is not reduced because of the tax exempt grant. Okay, so then moving on to the separate proposed rulemaking that Treasury published today. So we had commenters had weighed in and asked for more clarity about how joint ownership arrangements or co-ownership arrangements involving either exclusively tax exempt entities, government or nonprofit entities, for example, or mixed between tax exempt entities and taxable entities, if they co-own property that generates the IRA tax credits, the question is essentially, can the tax exempt entity utilize elective pay for its share of the co-ownership arrangement? And so under both the proposed and final elective pay rules, the eligibility determination for elective pay takes place at the level of the entity owning the credit. So if this were a partnership, partnerships are not applicable entities because they're not listed in the statutory list of entities that are considered applicable entities. And so so if a partnership owns the property, the partners cannot receive elective payments on their share even if the partner itself is an applicable entity, such as a tax exempt entity. However, we had emphasized in the proposed rules and clarified that if an applicable entity, such as a tax exempt entity or governmental entity, co-owns property through a joint ownership arrangement that makes what's called an election out of partnership tax status, then it can make an elective pay election for its share of the eligible credit property, and it's essentially treated as if it owns that property directly. Go to the next slide. So we had received comments and feedback from stakeholders that there was more certainty and more flexibility needed around these co-ownership arrangements, and specifically, more certainty around how these types of arrangements can validly elect out of partnership tax treatment to be able to take advantage of elective pay in the way that I had just described. And so they specifically, stakeholders had raised situations, that were common to these types of jointly owned and operated energy projects that, could have violated the existing rules for electing out of partnership tax treatment. So today, and in response, Treasury issued a notice of proposed rulemaking, and it adds exceptions to the existing regulations under the partnership tax rules. It adds exceptions to the existing election out requirements for co-ownership arrangements organized exclusively to produce electricity from applicable credit property, and that have one or more applicable co-owners that are applicable entities and are going to claim elective pay. And so the idea here is to provide more clarity and more flexibility for these types of co-ownership arrangements. And so it permits investments to be made. It clarifies that these types of investments can be made through a non-corporate entity rather than requiring direct co-ownership. So in other words, there can be an entity, perhaps an LLC, but there can be an entity that owns the project and owns the property, but that entity, as long as it validly elects out of partnerships tax status, the partners can then use, if there's an applicable entity partner, can use elective pay for their share. It also modifies some restrictions about joint marketing arrangements to provide that multi-year power purchase agreements or PPAs don't violate the requirements to elect out of partnership tax treatment. So bottom line is the proposed rules provide broader pathways for applicable entities to access elective pay when they co-own and operate projects with other entities. And so we issued the final elective pay regulations today, and this is separate proposed regulations to the partnership tax rules. So now this aspect of it is in a public comment period that will be open for 60 days. And we will certainly welcome feedback on these proposed rules before we finalize these. So I guess, I won't go also in the interest of time, won't go through details, but just to say, there is an example in the proposed rule itself of a co-ownership arrangement and how the circumstances under which and how it can elect out of partnerships tax status to use elective pay. So there's an example in the proposed rule itself, and this is another example that's intended to provide more clarity. But the bottom line here is that the elective pay eligible partner can make an elective payment election for its share. So just a note on the final the applicability date. So once effective, it'll be applicable for taxable years ending on or after publication in the Federal Register. Taxpayers with taxable years ending before that can choose to apply the final rules if done so entirely and in a consistent manner. Okay, and then so finally, the last aspect was just was going through the process for filing for claiming elective pay, and how entities can do that. And we'll point out some of the resources that are available to help entities that are claiming tax credits and using elective pay navigate the filing process. So an overview of how elective payments are, how do you take advantage of elective pay? How do you use it? So these are the basic steps. So first, identify and pursue the qualifying project or activity. So, let's say we're going to invest and, build a solar installation, or we will purchase an electric school bus, things that are eligible for the tax credits. And then, of course, you complete your project or you make the investment and you place it into service. Then you'll need to determine your tax year, keeping in mind the special rule for entities without filing obligations that I had discussed earlier. The tax year determines then when the tax return is due. Then there's the pre-filing registration. So once you've earned the credit, and so you go through the pre-filing registration process. The IRS gives you a registration number for each applicable property, and then you use that number to actually file and claim the tax credit. And the disclaimer there, the registration itself does not mean the IRS has determined the amount or validity of the credit. It's just providing a number that allows you to file for it. And then you need to file the required tax return, and we have more information about that. By the due date, there's also extensions, as there is with personal tax returns. 6 months extensions are available to make a valid direct pay or elective pay election. And then after that, the IRS would process that and make the payment. So here's an example of the timeline of a local government qualifying for the investment tax credit. It would claim the tax credit on what's called a Form 990T. And that's how it would both claim the tax credit and make the elective pay election to get paid for that, essentially get paid for that tax credit. It places the project in service in 2023. So then in late 2023 or early 2024, but before the tax return is due in May, it would complete the pre-filing registration process. The due date is May 15th, 2024. That's for an entity with a calendar year, tax year. Again, there's extensions. And then after the return is filed and processed, the IRS would make the payment. So I'll walk through. I mean, I think there's more information about how to actually do this at irs.gov/elective pay. And then the online portal is at irs.gov EPT register. You can see the address there. So there's more information there, but this is sort of a walkthrough of how the process works. So step one, your entity would create an account for your organization using the IRS portal, and then begin the registration process. Of course, only authorized representatives of the entity can register and provide information, and the personal identity of the representative is going to be verified during the registration process. So you would go to this website, click on clean energy, get started. But then there's a more comprehensive user guide and a video tutorial available at that web address. Thanks. So then just the next step is to select the type of entity you are. The user guide includes more information if you are uncertain as to what box to check here. And then there's certain fairly basic information to provide about address, banking information, to receive the payment, and then information about returns that are filed. So then this is still the pre-filing registration. You would select the credits your organization intends to claim using elective pay or direct pay. And then there'll be, depending on the credit, there'll be more specific information that may be required. But you can see the list of those 12 credits that I had discussed earlier here on the right. So then, so for each, let's say you have 2 facilities or 2 different properties, you need to file a pre-filing registration and get a number for each of them. So you do that separately for each facility or property. So you might get more than one registration number if you're claiming tax credits for 2 different things. And so in addition to providing some of the credit specific information on the last slide, such as the location of the facility, you'll need to provide some supporting documentation. And the user guide offers additional details, including how to use the bulk upload option if there are if you're filing for multiple things all at once. This is just to say, you can save your work, come back to it later, and then come back and say continue. And then when accurate and complete, you review it and then submit the request for information number for registration numbers. Then you can go online and monitor the status of the registration on your registrations site. The registration, once it's submitted, it can't be changed until it's returned with a registration number or an explanation for why a registration number was not issued. And so this is just a way to monitor the status as you await a registration number. So to conclude, I'll just point to some additional resources that have more detailed information than I had just provided. But irs.gov/elective pay has all the resources, the IRS, the pre-filing registration user guide, permission management user guide, FAQs as well. Cleanenergy.gov, which is a White House website, is a great resource for the IRA credits in general, and they have a homepage that's cleanenergy.gov/direct pay. Treasury now has an IRA homepage that was launched recently that has tons of information, including all of the guidance that has been issued on the IRA clean energy tax credits, and more information about how they're making an impact and a lot more information. So that's a great resource as well. And then you can subscribe, to the IRS e-news subscriptions specific to tax exempt and government entities to keep apprised generally of IRS, updated guidance and new releases. And then, so finally, the IRS has a IRS.gov clean energy that's about all of the IRA tax credits. And then the White House had published an Inflation Reduction Act guidebook that details each of the tax credits and lays out eligibility rules, who's eligible, how much the credit is, and that type of information. And also has information about the many other non-tax programs and potential funding opportunities that are available under the Inflation Reduction Act that are not tax credits. So with that, I'll conclude. Just want to thank all of the organizations that submitted feedback and comments during the elected pay comment period. Again, it was super helpful. And we hope this provides, some very helpful clarity for these critical investments that your organization is making. And with that, I'll kick it back to Christina and Ryan.
Seth, thank you so much for that presentation. Thank you also to Christina. This concludes our program for today. We hope that you will access the resources that Seth described in his presentation. Thank you very much.